Black artist's mural sparks a neighborhood revolution. The brick wall had been a canvas of racial slurs just yesterday. Now, under the amber glow of street lamps, Elijah Jackson stood back, paintbrush in hand, surveying the bold strokes of color emerging from the darkness. The mural was taking shape, vibrant faces of every hue rising from stylized roots that twisted and turned like the Mississippi River. Mrs. Abernathy, who'd lived in the same Victorian house across the street for 47 years, pulled her robe tighter as she peered through her curtains. That colored boy was up to something, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. Not in Oakridge Heights, not on her watch. Little did she know, by dawn, nothing in their neighborhood would ever be the same again. 3 weeks earlier, Elijah had stood in this exact spot, staring at the wall with different eyes. At 52, he'd spent decades believing his art belonged in prestigious galleries, not on street corners. But the rejection letter from the Westmore Art Exhibition, his 7th this year, had changed everything. The paper was still folded in his back pocket, the words practically memorized. While technically proficient, your work lacks the authentic cultural voice our exhibition seeks to amplify. Authentic cultural voice. The phrase had echoed in his mind as he drove home through the wealthy Oakridge Heights neighborhood where he'd recently rented a small apartment after his divorce. He'd pulled over when he spotted it, a wall defaced with spray-painted racial epithets that someone had half-heartedly tried to cover with beige paint, the hateful words still bleeding through like ghosts. "You lost, brother." The voice belonged to a mail carrier, Louis Washington, his postal uniform crisp despite the late afternoon heat. "Just thinking," Elijah replied, gesturing to the wall. Louis nodded knowingly. "Been like that for months. Nobody wants to deal with it. Neighborhood associations been arguing about it, but they can't agree on anything except that they don't want urban art bringing down property values." He made air quotes around the words urban art. "I'm an artist," Elijah said, surprising himself. "I could transform it." Louis looked him up and down, taking in Elijah's button-down shirt and loafers, so different from the younger street artists he'd seen. "No offense, but this neighborhood isn't exactly welcoming to, well, people who look like us, especially not with paint cans. Maybe that's exactly why it needs to happen. If you're enjoying this beginning of our journey, we cannot give this man carte blanche to 1 week then," Richard interrupted. "You have 1 week, Mr. Jackson. If we don't like it, it comes down." As Elijah left the community center, Louis was waiting outside, uniform replaced by jeans and a faded Motown t-shirt. "How'd it go?" "I've got 1 week to change their minds, and possibly this entire neighborhood." Louis laughed, the sound warm and deep. "Man, I've been delivering mail here for 15 years. These people don't change. They just get older and more set in their ways." "Everyone can change," Elijah said. "They just need a reason." The next morning, Elijah arrived at the wall before sunrise, a rental truck filled with supplies parked nearby. He began by painting the entire wall a deep midnight blue, covering the hateful words in darkness that would serve as the foundation for what was to come. He didn't notice Margaret watching from her car, parked half a block away, her hands clutching a cup of coffee that grew cold as she observed him work with unexpected precision and care. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. Some neighbors stood with arms crossed, whispering concerns about what this would do to their picturesque street. Others watched with cautious curiosity. Among them was Darius, a 17-year-old who lived with his grandmother 3 houses down. Unlike the others, he approached Elijah directly. "What are you painting?" he asked, hands shoved deep in his pockets, affecting teenage indifference though his eyes betrayed his interest. "Not sure yet," Elijah answered honestly, "but I know it needs roots." He gestured to the bottom of the wall where he'd begun painting intricate, twisting roots in varying shades of brown and gold. "Everything important has roots." Darius watched for a moment longer. "My grandma says you're asking for trouble." "Your grandma might be right." Elijah handed him a brush. "Want to help me find it?" The boy hesitated, looking back at the onlookers, then at the brush. Making his decision, he set down his backpack and took it. By afternoon, the crowd had grown, drawn by the unusual sight and neighborhood text chains buzzing with updates. Richard Tillman stood at the edge of the gathering, maintaining a careful distance while keeping watch. Carmen Rodriguez had brought a folding chair and sat openly, occasionally offering Elijah and Darius bottles of water. No one was more surprised than Elijah when Mrs. Abernathy approached, her posture stiff but determined. "You didn't submit any design for approval," she said, her voice carrying to the suddenly quiet crowd. Elijah continued painting. "No, ma'am, I didn't. The agreement was that if you don't like it when it's done, it comes down," Elijah interrupted, finally turning to face her. "But it's not done yet." "What exactly are you painting?" she demanded. Elijah stepped back, allowing her to see the wall more clearly. The roots had expanded, and now faces were emerging from them, faces of every age and ethnicity, some in period clothing from different eras, others modern, all connected by the same root system. "I'm painting Oakridge Heights," he said simply. "Not as it is, but as it could be." "This neighborhood has a long, proud history," Margaret began. "Yes, it does." Elijah pointed to a face he'd painted, an elderly white man with kind eyes. "That's Judge William Abernathy, isn't it? Your late husband. He ruled on the Jenkins housing discrimination case in 1977, one of the first in this county to stand against redlining." Margaret's mouth fell open slightly. "How did you research, Mrs. Abernathy? I learned about everyone who made this neighborhood what it is, the good and the bad. Your husband was one of the good ones, fighting against the very prejudice that someone expressed on this wall with spray paint." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. She looked at the partially completed image of her husband, rendered with dignity and respect. "I'd like to hear more about him," Elijah said quietly, "if you'd be willing to tell me. As the sun began to set and we approach our first half hour together, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and subscribe if you'd like to continue this journey with Elijah and the residents of Oakridge Heights." The next few days established a rhythm. Elijah would arrive before sunrise and work until well after sunset. Darius joined him after school, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine enthusiasm as Elijah taught him techniques and listened to his stories about growing up in a neighborhood where he often felt invisible. What surprised everyone was Margaret Abernathy's daily visits. At first, she came with concerns and criticisms, but each time Elijah would show her another historical figure he'd incorporated, people from the neighborhood's past who had contributed to its story in ways both acknowledged and forgotten. "That's Mrs. Gladwell," she said on the third day, pointing to a face Elijah had just completed. "She ran the neighborhood book club for 30 years, always served those horrible lemon squares that no one had the heart to tell her were dreadful." Elijah laughed, adding a subtle detail to the woman's brooch based on Margaret's description. "What about here?" he asked, pointing to an empty space near the center of the mural. Margaret's expression grew somber. "That's where the Winters family lived before they were forced out," Elijah finished. "In 1968, the only black family to ever own property in Oakridge Heights until the housing laws changed." Margaret nodded, looking down at her hands. "William, my husband, he tried to help them legally, but the neighborhood association at that time, they found other ways." "Would you mind if I include them?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I think it's important that you do." As the mural progressed, so did the neighborhood's involvement. Carmen organized a rotation of residents to bring food. Mr. Patel from the corner market donated bottles of water and set up a small canopy for shade. Even Richard Tillman rolled up his sleeves one afternoon to help Elijah move his scaffolding. But not everyone was pleased. Harold Jenkins, whose father had lost the landmark housing discrimination case to Judge Abernathy decades ago, watched from a distance, his disapproval evident. A small contingent of neighbors stood with him, their complaints growing louder as the mural attracted visitors from outside Oakridge Heights. "This was supposed to be a quiet solution to an unfortunate incident," Harold told anyone who would listen. "Not some kind of social statement that brings tour buses to our street." There had been no tour buses, of course, just a steady stream of people from neighboring communities who'd heard about the mural through social media posts and local news coverage. But for some residents, any change to their carefully maintained environment felt threatening. On the fifth day, Elijah arrived to find Louis waiting for him, his expression grave. "Someone came in the night," Louis said, gesturing to the wall. Red paint had been splashed across the central portion of the mural, obscuring several faces, including the partially completed Winters family and perhaps not coincidentally Judge Abernathy. Elijah stood silent, absorbing the damage. Around him, neighbors began to gather, their shocked murmurs filling the morning air. "I'm calling the police," Richard announced, phone already in hand. "Don't bother," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the anger and disappointment coursing through him. "This isn't about vandalism, it's about fear." "Fear of what?" Darius asked, arriving with his backpack slung over one shoulder, stopping short at the sight of the damage. "Fear of remembering," Elijah replied. "Fear of acknowledging that this perfect neighborhood has an imperfect history, just like all of us." Margaret pushed through the crowd, gasping when she saw her husband's image defaced. For a moment, she seemed to physically shrink, decades of careful composure crumbling. Then, straightening her shoulders, she turned to face the gathered neighbors. "Whoever did this is a coward," she declared, her voice ringing clear in the morning air. and they do not represent Oakridge Heights. With all due respect, Margaret, Harold stepped forward, some of us believe this mural has gone too far. Digging up the past serves no purpose except to divide us. The past is never really past, Harold, she replied, especially when we refuse to learn from it. The neighborhood stood divided, the defaced mural a physical manifestation of the rift that had always existed beneath the surface of their manicured lawns and neighborhood picnics. Elijah picked up a rag and began to gently clean away the red paint where it had splashed onto the surrounding images. "I can fix this," he said. "But I could use some help." There was a moment of hesitation, then Carmen stepped forward, taking a rag from Elijah's supply cart. Darius joined next, then Louis. One by one, neighbors chose sides, some walking away with Harold, but more joining Elijah at the wall. Most surprising was Margaret Abernathy, who kicked off her sensible pumps, rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, and reached for a brush. "Tell me what to do," she said to Elijah. "I can't paint like you, but I can follow directions." "Actually," Elijah said, "I think it's time for something different." He gathered everyone around, explaining his new vision, not just to repair the damage, but to incorporate it, to make the act of vandalism itself part of the neighborhood's story. As they worked together through the day, something shifted. Barriers that had seemed insurmountable began to dissolve. Carmen shared stories of growing up in Puerto Rico before moving to the mainland for college in 1972, never imagining she'd one day retire in a neighborhood like Oakridge Heights. Mr. Patel described arriving from Gujarat in 1985 with $200 in his pocket and a dream of owning his own business. Even Richard Tillman opened up, revealing that his own grandparents had faced housing discrimination in another state, their Romanian Jewish heritage marking them as undesirable in the post-war housing boom. "My father changed our last name from Tilmanovich," he admitted. "He thought it would be easier for us to fit in." By sunset, the red paint had been transformed. Instead of obscuring the faces, it now formed a winding river connecting them, reminiscent of the roots at the bottom of the mural but flowing upward toward the future. "Rivers carry both nurturing water and destructive floods," Elijah explained to the gathered neighbors. "They can divide communities or connect them. The choice is always ours." As darkness fell and the neighborhood dispersed, Elijah remained, adding final touches by the light of portable lamps. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice the black SUV parking down the street or the woman who emerged, camera in hand, her press credentials catching the streetlight as she approached. "Mr. Jackson," she called. "Vanessa Washington from the Metropolitan Tribune. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your mural and the controversy it's creating." Elijah turned, surprised. "Controversy? We've received reports of community division, vandalism, even threats." She held up her phone, showing him social media posts from Harold and his supporters, claiming the mural was erasing the traditional character of the neighborhood and promoting a divisive agenda. "That's not what this is about," Elijah began, but Vanessa was already taking photos of the wall. "Is it true you didn't get proper approval for this project? That you're essentially forcing your vision on a community that didn't ask for it?" "That's not," Elijah stopped, recognizing the trap. Whatever he said would be framed to fit the story she'd already decided to write. "No comment. If you want to understand the mural, come back tomorrow when it's complete. See it for yourself in the daylight, not through someone else's eyes." After she left, Elijah sat on the curb, suddenly exhausted. The weight of the past week, the connections formed, the hostility faced, the history unearthed, settled over him like a heavy blanket. Tough night. Louis appeared, still in his postal uniform after a late shift. "I didn't start this to create controversy," Elijah sighed. "I just wanted to make something beautiful out of something ugly." Louis sat beside him. "Man, you were never just changing a wall. You were changing a conversation this neighborhood has been avoiding for generations. Maybe some conversations are better left alone." "You don't believe that," Louis said. "Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." Elijah looked up at the mural, at the faces emerging from darkness into light, connected by roots and rivers and shared history. "No, I guess I don't. For what it's worth," Louis added, "my route takes me past every house in Oakridge Heights. I hear what people say when they think no one's listening, and since you started this mural, those conversations have changed." "For better or worse?" Louis smiled. "Growth is always uncomfortable, brother, but necessary." As the night deepened and we approach our midpoint together, I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe if you haven't already and let me know in the comments how this story resonates with your own experiences of community transformation. The final day dawned clear and warm, perfect for the mural's completion. Elijah arrived to find an unexpected sight, a small crowd already gathered, many with brushes and paint clothes ready to help. We heard about the reporter, Carmen explained. And the social media posts. We thought you might need some moral support. And maybe a few extra hands, added Darius, who had brought 3 friends from his high school art class. Even more surprising was the arrival of Richard Tillman, not in his usual business attire, but in jeans and a faded Pink Floyd t-shirt that looked like a relic from his college days in the late 70s. The association has my proxy today, he announced. I thought I'd be more useful here. By mid-morning, the crowd had swelled. Under Elijah's guidance, they worked on the surrounding areas of the mural, adding details to the landscape, enhancing the flowing river of red that now connected the historical figures to modern-day residents. Margaret arrived just before noon, accompanied by an elderly black man who walked with a cane and carried himself with quiet dignity. Elijah, she called, there's someone you should meet. The man extended his hand. James Winters, he said simply. Elijah's brush nearly fell from his grip. Winters, from the family that was forced out in '68, yes. His voice was gentle but firm. Margaret tracked me down, said you were painting our story. I was trying to, Elijah admitted, but I only had newspaper accounts, court records. I don't know your real story. James looked up at the mural, at the space where Elijah had begun to paint his family based on a single grainy photograph from the court documents. You got my father's eyes right, he said after a moment. He had kind eyes even after everything they put us through. For the next hour, James sat on a folding chair provided by Carmen, sharing memories of his brief childhood in Oakridge Heights, the beautiful garden his mother had planted, the tree house his father had built, the neighbors who had welcomed them and those who had not. As he spoke, Elijah painted, bringing the Winters family to life at the center of the mural, no longer just symbolic figures but real people with hopes and losses and enduring dignity. Other neighbors gathered to listen, some old enough to remember the events firsthand, others hearing this history for the first time. Harold Jenkins stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable as James described the role Harold's father had played in the family's expulsion. When James finished his story, a heavy silence fell over the gathering. It was broken by the unexpected arrival of Vanessa Washington, the reporter from the previous night, accompanied by a photographer. Mr. Jackson, she called, her tone professional but warmer than before. I took your advice and came back in the daylight. This is not what I expected. Before Elijah could respond, Margaret stepped forward. If you're looking for controversy, Ms. Washington, you'll find it. But you'll also find reconciliation if you care to report on that as well. Vanessa surveyed the scene, the diverse crowd working together, James Winters reconnecting with the neighborhood that had once rejected his family, the mural itself with its intertwining stories of past and present. Actually, she said, I think I'd like to hear the whole story, the real one. As the afternoon progressed, the mural neared completion. What had begun as Elijah's solitary project had become a community endeavor, with dozens of residents contributing under his guidance. The final element was the sky above the intertwined figures, a sky that transformed from the deep midnight blue at one end to a brilliant sunrise at the other. Everyone deserves a new dawn, Elijah explained as he mixed colors, teaching Darius and his friends how to create the perfect gradient. A chance to be more than their past. Harold Jenkins had remained at the periphery all day, watching but not participating. As the sun began its descent, he finally approached Elijah, who was adding the last touches to the sunrise. My father wasn't a monster, Harold said without preamble. He believed he was protecting his home, his way of life. Elijah continued painting. Many injustices begin with good intentions. You've painted everyone else from that time. Where is he in your mural? Elijah stepped back, gesturing to a figure near the Winters family, a man with his back turned, facing away from the others. That's how you see him, turning his back on justice. Harold's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby workers. No, Elijah said quietly. That's how he was positioned in the only photograph I could find of him with the Winters family. At their hearing, he couldn't face them. Harold stared at the figure, recognition dawning in his eyes. I remember that day. I was just a boy, but I remember my father coming home, locking himself in his study. My mother said he'd done what was necessary, but he didn't speak for days afterward. People are complicated, Elijah said. Even those who do wrong often know it, somewhere deep inside. Harold was silent for a long moment. The red paint, he finally said. It wasn't me, but I didn't stop it either. I knew some of the younger residents were planning something. I could have spoken up. There's still time to choose a different path, Elijah replied, offering him a brush. This part of the sky still needs work. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. After a moment's hesitation, Harold accepted the brush, joining the effort as the sun began to set on the final day of the project. As darkness fell, portable lights were set up, illuminating the completed mural in all its glory. The neighborhood gathered before it, not just those who had worked on it, but nearly every resident of Oakridge Heights, drawn by text messages and phone calls spreading the news of its completion. "It's not what I expected," Richard Tillman admitted, standing beside Elijah. "When you first proposed covering up those slurs, I thought you'd just paint something. Safe, beautiful, but forgettable." "Sometimes beauty needs to challenge us to be remembered," Elijah replied. "The association votes tomorrow on whether it stays," Richard reminded him. "That was our agreement." Elijah nodded, surveying the crowd's reactions, the mix of awe, discomfort, pride, and reflection on their faces as they took in the mural's complex narrative. "Whatever they decide," he said, "the conversation has already changed." Margaret Abernathy made her way through the crowd, James Winters at her side. "It's magnificent," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "William would have been proud to be part of this." "As would my parents," James added, looking up at his family's image, restored to the neighborhood that had once cast them out. Vanessa Washington approached with her photographer, who was capturing the community's reactions. "Mr. Jackson, would you care to make a statement about what you've created here?" Elijah looked at the faces around him, at Darius and his friends, their young lives just beginning, at Louis in his postal uniform having come straight from his route, at Carmen and Mr. Patel and the dozens of others who had contributed in ways both large and small, at Margaret and James, unlikely allies bridging a historical divide, even at Harold, still working on the sky with careful, precise strokes. "I didn't create this," he said finally. "We all did. The mural was just a catalyst. The real art is what happened between people." "And what exactly happened here?" Vanessa pressed. Elijah smiled. "A neighborhood remembered its whole self, the beautiful and the ugly, the proud and the shameful, and in remembering found a way forward together." The next morning, the Oakridge Heights Neighborhood Association met in emergency session to vote on the mural's fate. The community center was packed, with residents spilling out into the hallway, all eager to have their voices heard. Margaret Abernathy, as the association's longest-serving member, spoke first. "For 50 years, I've worked to preserve what I thought made Oakridge Heights special. Its appearance, its exclusivity, its untroubled surface," she began, her voice steady. "I was wrong. What makes this neighborhood special isn't how it looks, but who we are to each other. This mural has revealed both our wounds and our capacity for healing. I vote that it stays, not just for a season, but permanently." The debate that followed was passionate but respectful. Those opposed worried about setting precedents, about property values, about attracting too much attention to their quiet streets. Those in favor spoke of transformation, of honest reckoning, of the unexpected connections formed during the project. James Winters, invited to speak as a special guest, rose slowly to his feet. "60 years ago, this community told my family we didn't belong," he said. "Today, I see my parents' faces on that wall, restored to the neighborhood that rejected them. Some might call that justice, but I call it something more powerful: redemption, not just for my family, but for all of Oakridge Heights." When the votes were tallied, the result was decisive if not unanimous. The mural would stay. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached Elijah, who had sat quietly throughout the proceedings. "The association would like to commission you for another project," he said, offering an envelope. "We have other walls in Oakridge Heights, other stories that need telling." Elijah accepted the envelope but didn't open it. "I have one condition," he said. "Which is?" "Darius leads the next project with my mentorship." Richard glanced across the room at the teenager, who was deep in conversation with James Winters. "He's just a kid." "He's the future of this neighborhood," Elijah countered. "And he has more talent than I did at twice his age." Outside the community center, Elijah found Louis waiting, as he had been since that first day at the wall. "So," Louis said, falling into step beside him. "Revolution accomplished?" Elijah laughed. "Hardly. One mural doesn't undo generations of division." "No," Louis agreed, "but it's a hell of a start." They walked together toward the wall that had brought them all together. No longer a canvas of hate speech hastily covered, but a vibrant testimony to a community's complex past and hopeful future. Margaret Abernathy was already there, speaking with Vanessa Washington beside a small plaque that had been installed overnight. It read simply, "The roots and rivers of Oakridge Heights, a community remembers." "Your mural made the front page," Vanessa told Elijah, holding up the morning edition of the Metropolitan Tribune. The headline read, "Art transforms more than just a wall in historic neighborhood." "Not my mural," Elijah corrected gently. "Ours." As residents began to gather once more around the wall, drawn by some unspoken understanding that this place had become significant beyond its physical presence, Elijah found himself standing beside James Winters. "My father used to say that hate is loud but short-lived," James remarked, gazing up at his family's image. "Love is quieter but endures. I think he was right." Elijah nodded. "The slurs on this wall shouted, but they didn't last. What we created together speaks more softly, but it will outlive us all." As the morning sun illuminated the mural, the roots delving deep into shared soil, the river of transformed pain connecting past to present, the dawn breaking over a neighborhood finally seeing itself whole, Darius approached with a sketchbook in hand. "I've been thinking about the next wall," he said, showing Elijah his preliminary drawings. "If that's really happening." "It's happening," Elijah confirmed. "But this time you lead, I follow." The boy's face lit up with surprise and determination. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Elijah said, looking around at the gathered community, at all they had built together from the broken pieces of their shared history. "None of us will, not anymore." As our journey with Elijah and the residents of Oakridge Heights comes to a close, I'd like to thank you for experiencing this story with me. If you found meaning in their transformation, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. What walls in your own community might be transformed through art and honest conversation?